Blood is a terrifying thing when it doesn't belong to you. When the serrated edge of the hyper-lathe bit into Dean's arm, he expected a reprimand from the instructor. He expected a few stitches and a ruined shirt. What he didn't expect was for his alien classmates to drop to their knees, weeping and preparing his last rites. To them, a punctured epidermis was an agonizing death sentence. To Dean, it was just a Tuesday, and he was mostly pissed about the shirt. The ambient hum of the fabrication lab vibrated straight through the soles of Dean's boots, settling deep in his molars. It was a low, resonant frequency, designed to keep the silicon-based students from entering a dormant state. But all it did for Dean was give him a low-grade migraine. He ground his teeth together, tasting the faint, metallic tang of aerosolized coolant that hung in the dry air. Advanced xenomechanics was supposed to be a purely theoretical elective. That was the lie the brochure had sold him. Instead, here he was in Bay 4, up to his elbows in grease that smelled faintly of burnt sugar, wrestling with a thermal manifold casing the size of a car engine. Gravity on the station was set to 1.1 Earth normal. It wasn't enough to crush him, but it was enough to make every movement feel like he was moving underwater. His joints ached. His lower back was a tight knot of protesting muscle. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching in his eyebrows before dripping onto the reinforced glass of the workbench. Dean, your thermal output is deviating by 0.2%. The voice came from his left. The translation collar around Dean's neck rendered the alien's complex series of clicks and pneumatic hisses into a perfectly flat Midwestern accent. The collar had also assigned the alien a localized Western name to spare human vocal cords. Therefore, the 8-foot-tall, chitinous creature that looked like a praying mantis constructed out of obsidian glass was named Chloe. "I see it, Chloe," Dean grunted, shifting his weight. He gripped the heavy tension lever with both hands. The metal was cold, ribbed for a grip he didn't quite possess, and slick with condensation. "The retaining clamp is sticking. I need to force it past the locking pin. Forcing physical components is structurally inefficient," chimed Bennett. Bennett was huddled on the other side of the manifold. If Chloe was all sharp angles and glass, Bennett was a collection of heavy, gray boulders strapped together by thick, pulsating hydrostatic tubes. The collar gave him the voice of a mild-mannered accountant. Bennett's species didn't breathe oxygen. He smelled perpetually of wet concrete and ozone. "Yeah, well, efficiency isn't going to get this casing seated before Professor Higgins comes back," Dean muttered. He wiped his palms on the thighs of his cargo pants. The fabric was already stiff with a week's worth of accumulated workshop grime. He leaned back over the manifold. The casing was a dull, heavy gray, constructed from a tungsten composite that could withstand the heat of a minor star. The edges of the internal heat sinks were serrated to increase surface area. They were also razor sharp. Dean knew this. Professor Higgins, a gelatinous orb of a teacher who communicated entirely through color changes, had flashed a vivid warning orange about it at the start of the semester. "Arthur, hold the base steady," Dean instructed. Arthur, a squatter, leathery alien with 4 heavily jointed arms, grunted. Arthur was the only one in the group whose translated name somewhat matched his personality. He had the weary demeanor of a middle-aged dock worker. Arthur braced his lower 2 limbs against the floor grating and clamped his upper hands onto the base of the manifold. "Ready," Arthur said. his vocal sacs inflating and deflating with a wet, leathery sound. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Dean threw his weight backward, pulling the lever. The mechanism groaned. The locking pin resisted, grinding against the casing with a screech that sent a shiver down Dean's spine. He pulled harder, his boots slipping slightly on the slick metal floor. His biceps bunched, straining under the artificial gravity. The pin didn't just give way, it sheared completely off. The loud, percussive crack echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the lab. Without the pin's resistance, the lever snapped backward with explosive force. Dean's momentum carried him with it. He stumbled, his boots losing purchase entirely. As he fell, his left arm swung wildly to catch his balance, dropping straight into the open, serrated mouth of the heatsink. He didn't feel the cut. Not at first. What he felt was a massive, blunt impact, like being hit in the forearm with a baseball bat. The kinetic force of the metal edge slamming into his flesh knocked the breath out of his lungs. He hit the floor grating hard, his knees taking the brunt of the impact, jarring his spine. "Dean!" Chloe's translation snapped out. Though underneath the English word, Dean could hear the frantic, high-pitched scratching of her mandibles. I'm good, Dean gasped, squeezing his eyes shut as the impact rattled his brain. He pushed himself up into a kneeling position. His left arm felt numb, entirely detached from the rest of his body. It was a cold, heavy block of meat hanging from his shoulder. He looked down. His favorite flannel shirt, a faded, soft red and black plaid he'd brought all the way from Earth, was torn open from the elbow to the middle of his bicep. The fabric wasn't just sliced, it was chewed, ragged threads hanging loose. Beneath the tear, his skin was parted. It was a strange, clinical sight for the first fraction of a second. The laceration was deep, at least an inch into the muscle. The edges of the wound were stark white, the fascia and subcutaneous fat exposed to the sterile lab air. It didn't look real. It looked like a cross-section in a medical textbook. He could see the striations of his own muscle tissue, pale and twitching in the sudden cold. Then the shock wore off, and his circulatory system caught up. The white ditch filled with red. It didn't seep. It welled up instantly, a dark, heavy crimson that looked almost black under the harsh fluorescent lights. It spilled over the edges of his skin, soaking into the flannel, turning the fabric a wet, sticky maroon. The numbness vanished, replaced by a sudden electric heat. It felt like someone had laid a hot soldering iron directly against his nerves. Dean sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth, his right hand instinctively hovering over the wound, afraid to touch it. Ah! Son of a... A heavy, wet splat hit the floor, grating between his knees. Then another. Splat. 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 The blood was dripping from his elbow, pooling on the grated floor, slipping through the metal diamonds to the subfloor below. Dean looked up to ask Arthur for a rag. The words died in his throat. Arthur was no longer holding the manifold. The leathery alien had backed away, his forearms plastered against his broad chest. His skin, normally a healthy, mottled gray, was rapidly bleaching to an ashen white. His vocal sacs were fully inflated, trembling violently, emitting a high, reedy keening sound that pierced right through Dean's eardrums. "Arthur?" Dean managed, his voice tight. Chloe was worse. The towering insectoid had scrambled backward so fast her claws had gouged deep scratches into the reinforced floor. She was backed into a corner, her compound eyes blown wide, shifting rapidly through a spectrum of terrified violet. A sharp, acrid smell suddenly flooded the room, like sulfur and burnt hair. It was Chloe's biological fear response, a pheromone dump so intense it made Dean's eyes water. Bennett had simply frozen, his hydrostatic tubes locked up, turning him into a rigid statue of gray boulders. A synthesized voice, flat and uninflected, began repeating from his translation collar. Hull breach, catastrophic fluid loss, hull breach. Guys, Dean said. He tried to stand, but a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. The adrenaline was peaking, making his heart hammer against his ribs. It pumped harder. The bleeding accelerated. The splat, splat, splat turned into a steady, sickening trickle. He swayed, grabbing the edge of the workbench with his good hand to steady himself. The metal was cold against his sweaty palm. Dean! Chloe's translated voice was a broken whisper. Your core fluid. It is escaping. You are depressurizing. To Chloe's species, an exoskeleton was a pressurized seal. A breach of this size meant immediate internal rupture. To Arthur, whose biology relied on perfectly balanced hydrostatic pressure to keep his internal organs from collapsing, a fluid leak was fatal within seconds. They didn't have a concept of a localized flesh wound. They didn't have veins that could constrict or blood that could clot. To them, Dean was a punctured balloon. He was a dead man walking. I'm not depressurizing, Dean grunted. The pain was fully awake now, a hot, throbbing pulse that beat in time with his racing heart. It was blinding. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting down a sudden, violent wave of nausea. His stomach churned. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't some hardened space marine. He was a 22-year-old engineering student who had just filleted his own arm, and he was terrified. But he wasn't dying. He opened his eyes. The blood was a problem. It was slick and warm, running down his forearm, soaking into the cuff of his shirt, making his fingers sticky and useless. The sheer volume of it was alarming. Human blood is dramatic. It stains easily. It smells distinct. The smell of iron bloomed in the dry, sterile air of the lab. It was a heavy, coppery scent, ancient and raw. It smelled like a butcher shop. It smelled like life spilling out where it shouldn't be. Arthur's keening grew louder. The alien sank to his knees, his heavy head bowing. He was mourning. He was watching his classmate die, helpless to stop the inevitable deflation. Stop that, Dean hissed, his breath coming short. He looked around the lab, his vision tunneling slightly at the edges. I need the medical kit. Where is the first aid station? Bennett remained frozen. Hull breach, awaiting stasis pod. Chloe didn't move from her corner. Her mandibles were clicking so fast it sounded like hail on a tin roof. Do not speak, Dean. Conserve your remaining pressure. We have signaled the end of cycle authorities. They will bring the cryo bags. Cryo bags? I don't need a body bag, Chloe. I need a damn bandage, Dean yelled, the frustration momentarily cutting through the pain. He pushed off the workbench. His legs felt like they were made of damp sand. He stumbled toward the bright green cross painted on the far wall. Every step left a distinct, wet red footprint on the grating. He ripped open the medical cabinet with his right hand. He stared at the contents, his heart sinking. There were no gauze pads, no bandages, no antiseptic wipes. There were only rows of silver canisters labeled in an alien script. Stasis foam, chemical coagulants designed for silicon biology, thermal sealants that operated at 300 degrees, guaranteed to cauterize a wound and also amputate the limb in the process. It was utterly useless to human biology. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the cabinet. The throbbing in his arm was escalating from a burn to a vicious, biting agony. His fingers were starting to tingle. He was bleeding too much. He knew enough basic first aid to know that if he didn't put pressure on it soon, the blood loss would make him pass out. And if he passed out here, his classmates would probably put him in a cryo bag alive. "All right," Dean muttered to himself. "Okay, think." He turned back to the workbench. He needed pressure. He needed something clean. He looked at Arthur, who was now swaying back and forth on his knees, his lower arms wrapping around his own torso as if trying to hold himself together in sympathy. "Arthur! Hey, look at me!" Dean barked. Arthur's heavy eyelids fluttered. He looked up, his dark eyes wide with a horrified pity that made Dean sick to his stomach. I am so sorry, Dean," Arthur whispered through the collar. "You were a good unit. I will record your final thermal output for the archives." "I'm not dying, you idiot," Dean spat, dragging himself back toward the workbench. "My species has a localized circulatory system. It's just a scratch, a deep scratch. It's not a hull breach." None of them believed him. He could see it in their posture. They thought he was delirious. They thought this was the final, tragic denial of a dying organism. Dean gave up trying to explain. He reached the workbench and scanned the scattered tools. His eyes landed on a spool of industrial binding tape, a heavy synthetic polymer used to seal vacuum tubes. It was essentially space-age duct tape. Next to it was a stack of unopened synthetic shop rags, sealed in plastic to keep them sterile for delicate mechanical wiping. It would have to do. Dean slumped onto the stool beside the workbench. His face felt cold. He knew he must look pale. The skin of his face was drawn tight, a sheen of cold sweat making his forehead gleam under the harsh lights. He grabbed the plastic-wrapped shop rag with his right hand. He brought it to his mouth and tore the plastic open with his teeth. He spat the plastic aside. The rag was stiff, meant to absorb heavy machine oils, not blood, but it was sterile. He needed to expose the wound completely. His ruined flannel sleeve was in the way, soaking wet and sticking to the laceration. He gripped the torn edge of the fabric with his right hand, clamped his teeth down on the cuff, and ripped. The sound of the thick fabric tearing was loud in the silence of the lab. Chloe shrieked. It was a terrible, grating sound. "He is dismantling his outer layers. The madness has taken him." "It's a shirt, Chloe," Dean yelled back, spitting out a piece of red thread. "It's clothing. It's not my skin." He finally tore the sleeve away, tossing the sodden mass onto the floor. It hit with a heavy, wet slap. The wound was fully exposed now. It was ugly. A jagged, gaping mouth of red and white, bubbling with dark blood. Dean took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew this was going to hurt worse than the initial cut. He folded the stiff synthetic rag in half. then in half again, creating a thick, dense pad. He pressed it directly into the open wound. A sharp, breathless sound escaped his lips. The pain was blinding, a brilliant white flash behind his eyelids. His vision swam. He bit down on his lower lip hard enough to taste copper there, too. His right hand clamped down on the rag, applying brutal, unrelenting pressure. He sat there for a long moment, eyes closed, breathing heavily through his nose. In, out, in, out. He waited for the wave of nausea to crest and break. He could feel the blood soaking into the rag, warming it against his skin, but the direct pressure was doing its job. The terrifying free flow was slowing. He is compressing the breach, Bennett's translation collar finally muttered, the silicon alien breaking out of his loop. He is manually sealing his own casing. Is it working? Arthur asked, his voice trembling. He hadn't moved from his knees. I don't know, Chloe whispered. He is covered in his own vital fluids. The smell. It is the smell of organic rot. Dean opened his eyes. The pain was settling into a dull, heavy throb. He glared at the insectoid. It smells like iron, Chloe. Stop being dramatic. He needed to bind it. He couldn't sit here holding his arm forever. He reached for the heavy spool of industrial tape. It was bulky, and managing it with one hand was a nightmare. He pressed the rag down with his left elbow against his ribcage, freeing his right hand to peel up the edge of the tape. He stuck the end of the tape to his bicep, just above the rag. Then, using his teeth to pull the spool and his right hand to guide it, he began to wrap the tape around his arm. He pulled it brutally tight. The tape dug into his skin, catching the fine hairs on his arm and pulling them out by the roots. He hissed in annoyance, wrapping it twice, 3 times, 4 times around the rag, creating a makeshift pressure dressing. The tape was silver, a stark, industrial contrast to the red blood smudged all over his skin and the pale white of his forearm. He bit the tape off the spool, smoothing the end down with a blood-slicked thumb. He sat back, exhausted. His breathing was still erratic, but he felt grounded again. The crisis had passed. The primal panic in his chest was receding, replaced by a deep, hollow fatigue and a profound annoyance. He looked down at his ruined flannel shirt, his blood-stained pants, and the puddle of crimson on the floor. Damn it, Dean muttered, wiping a streak of sweat from his forehead with the back of his clean wrist. I really liked this shirt. The silence in the room was absolute. He looked up. Arthur, Chloe, and Bennett were staring at him. They were no longer screaming. They were no longer keening. They were perfectly, terrifyingly still. They were looking at him not as a dying classmate, but as a biological impossibility. A ghost. A creature that had just watched its own vital fluids spill onto the floor, forcefully packed the breach with debris, taped it shut with construction materials, and was now complaining about its garments. Arthur slowly pointed a trembling, leathery finger at Dean's arm. Are you undead? Dean sighed, leaning back against the workbench. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard. He felt cold, and his arm throbbed in time with his heartbeat. No, Arthur, I'm a human. We coagulate. Coagulate, Bennett repeated, the translation software struggling with the concept before delivering it in a flat tone. Your fluid solidifies to repair the hull? Basically, Dean said, too tired to give a biology lesson. He looked at the mess on the floor. It was going to take an hour to clean up. He looked at his shaking hands, sticky with drying blood. He sighed again, a long, weary sound. Does anyone know if Professor Higgins gives extensions for self-inflicted lacerations? Dean asked, looking between the three frozen aliens. Because I'm definitely not going to be able to torque that manifold today. Nobody answered him. Chloe just took another step back, her eyes fixed on the silver tape wrapped around his arm, as if expecting it to burst open and swallow them all. The blood on the floor grating was already beginning to congeal, turning from a slick, bright crimson pool into a dark, tacky smear. Dean stared down at it. His head felt light, a slow, rotating carousel of mild vertigo that he tried to blink away. He drew a deep breath through his nose. The harsh, metallic scent of his own iron was clashing violently with the burnt sugar smell of the lab's aerosol coolant. He needed a mop. He pushed himself off the workbench, his boots making a soft, sticky sound against the floor. His left arm hung heavy at his side, wrapped in the thick silver wad of industrial tape. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat, a localized heartbeat of pain that radiated up to his shoulder and down into his fingertips. His fingers were slightly swollen, the tape likely a bit too tight, restricting the blood flow. He didn't care. Tight was safe. Tight kept the fluid inside the casing. He dragged a heavy yellow biohazard bucket and a chemical sponge mop from the corner closet. When he returned to the workbench, his three classmates were still frozen in a wide semicircle, observing him with the horrified fascination of onlookers at a multi-car pileup. Dean dropped the mop into the bucket of blue solvent. It splashed, the sound loud in the quiet lab. Chloe flinched. Her compound eyes shuddered rapidly. Dean, you must not exert yourself. Your structural integrity is compromised. Movement will widen the breach. The breach is taped, Chloe, Dean muttered, leaning his weight against the mop handle. He squeezed the excess blue solvent from the sponge. And if I don't clean this up, Professor Higgins is going to drop my grade for leaving a biohazard in a sterile workspace. He slapped the wet sponge onto the metal grating. As the blue solvent hit the red blood, it foamed, emitting a faint hiss and a smell like bleach and old pennies. Arthur took a hesitant, shuffling step forward. His four leathery arms were still crossed defensively over his chest. Dean, does your chassis not register the damage? Is your sensory network offline? You mean, does it hurt? Dean asked, scrubbing the mop back and forth. The physical exertion was making him sweat again, a cold, clammy sweat this time. Yeah, Arthur, it hurts like a bitch. It feels like someone buried a hot coal in my bicep. Then why are you performing maintenance tasks? Bennett chimed in, his hydrostatic tubes pulsing a nervous, muddy brown color. In the presence of catastrophic pain stimuli, a logical organism enters a dormant preservation state. You are scrubbing the floor, because ignoring it is easier than panicking, Dean said flatly. He leaned his weight onto the mop, scraping a particularly stubborn, coagulated clot off the metal diamond tread. And because back on Earth, if you bleed on the shop floor, you clean it up. Nobody else is going to do it for you. He paused, resting his chin on his hands atop the mop handle, catching his breath. The room tilted slightly to the left. He grounded his boots, forcing his knees to lock. He couldn't pass out. If he passed out, they'd panic, and he'd wake up in a gelatinous stasis pod meant for silicon-based life forms, which would probably suffocate him. "Bennett," Dean said, his voice a little thinner than he intended. "What's the volume of the fluid on the floor? You scanned it earlier." Bennett's ocular sensors whirred, focusing on the foaming blue and red puddle. "Approximately 0.4 liters of core fluid, plus the volume absorbed by your discarded outer layer." Dean did the math in his head. Half a liter. About a pint. You could donate a pint of blood and walk out of a clinic with a juice box and a cookie. He was fine. He was just tired, and the adrenaline crash was hollowing him out. "I have 5 liters in me," Dean said, turning back to the bucket to rinse the mop. "Losing a tenth of it isn't going to kill me. My body is already making more." The mop splashed into the water. Behind him, he heard Arthur's vocal sacs inflate with a sharp, wet gasp. "It is regenerating the lost fluid?" Arthur asked, the translation software struggling to convey the sheer disbelief in the alien's tone. "Automatically, without an external synthetic infusion?" "Bone marrow," Dean grunted, lifting the mop again. "It's a slow process, but yeah, it'll replace it. The real problem isn't the fluid loss right now. It's the hole." He finished scrubbing the floor. The metal was clean, though a faint pinkish tint lingered in the deep scratches of the grating. He tossed the mop back into the bucket and slumped onto the stool. He looked at the silver tape on his arm. The edges of the gray synthetic rag poking out from underneath were stained a rusty brown, but the blood wasn't dripping anymore. The tape had held. "I need to go to the infirmary," Dean said, his voice heavy. "The tape stops the bleeding, but there's dirt and grease in the cut. If it gets infected, I'm actually in trouble." "Infected," Chloe repeated. She sounded like she was tasting a sour fruit. "Microbial invasion of the internal systems. Yes, we will escort you to the termination prevention ward. We must move slowly. Do not jostle your chassis." "It's just walking, Chloe," Dean sighed, pushing himself up from the stool. His legs felt like lead pipes, heavy and uncooperative. "I'm not made of glass." The walk to the campus medical bay felt like a death march. The primary corridors of the orbital university were wide and brightly lit, bathed in a sterile, icy blue luminescence that made Dean's pale skin look faintly gray. The gravity in the hallways was standardized to 0.8 Earth normal, a relief on his aching joints, but it made his footing feel slightly disjointed. He walked in the center of the corridor. Arthur flanked him on his right, Chloe on his left, and Bennett trailed directly behind him. They moved at an excruciatingly slow pace, forming a protective, defensive ring around him. Every time another student passed them, a gliding, translucent cephalopod, or a towering, fur-covered biped, Chloe would emit a sharp, aggressive hiss, flaring her mandibles and waving her forelimbs to clear the path. "Chloe, stop that," Dean muttered, keeping his right hand clamped over his taped left arm. "You look like a deranged traffic cop. I'm fine." "You are leaking vital fluids beneath that primitive adhesive, Dean," Chloe snapped back, her compound eyes darting left and right. "The ambient microbes in this corridor could infiltrate your compromised casing at any moment. We must secure your perimeter." Dean rolled his eyes, but he lacked the energy to argue. His arm was a solid block of throbbing misery. Every step jarred the sliced muscle fibers. He focused on the steady hum of the station's air recyclers, using the white noise to drown out the burning sensation in his bicep. The infirmary was located in Sector 3. The sliding pneumatic doors hissed open, revealing a large, cavernous room filled with hanging monitoring stations, pressurized fluid tanks, and several large egg-shaped stasis pods. The air here smelled aggressively clean, a sharp tang of ozone, ammonia, and something that smelled faintly of crushed mint. The duty medic was a Dr. Gibbs. Gibbs belonged to a species Dean hadn't seen much of on campus. He was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with a skeletal, multi-jointed frame wrapped in a leathery, pale blue membrane. He had no discernible head, just a thick neck that ended in a cluster of 6 independent stalk-like eyes and a vertical, slit-like mouth positioned on his upper chest. Gibbs was currently adjusting the pressure valves on a tank of liquid methane. "Dr. Gibbs," Arthur called out, his vocal sacs trembling. "We have a critical emergency. Structural breach. Core fluid loss." Gibbs's 6 eye stalks whipped around, focusing instantly on the group. The alien moved with frightening speed, his multi-jointed legs clicking against the pristine white floor tiles as he crossed the room. "Structural breach?" Gibbs's translation collar produced a crisp, authoritative voice. He assessed the 4 of them, his eyes rapidly scanning. "Who is the patient? I see no depressurization." "It is the human," Bennett said, pointing a blocky gray appendage at Dean. Gibbs's eye stalks swiveled to Dean, dropping to the silver industrial tape wrapped tightly around his left arm. The medic's slit mouth contracted in confusion. "Human Dean," Gibbs said, stepping closer. The smell of ammonia intensified. "My sensors indicate a localized thermal anomaly and elevated heart rate. What is the nature of this appendage modification?" "It's not a modification, Doc," Dean said wearily. He stepped out of his classmate's protective circle and moved toward a cold, metal examination table. He climbed onto it, sitting on the edge, letting his legs dangle. "I had an accident in the fab lab. The hyper lathe slipped. I took a hit from a heatsink casing. Serrated edge." Gibbs's eye stalks extended slightly, a sign of alarm. "A serrated laceration to an unarmored hydrocarbon casing? The fluid loss would be catastrophic. Why are you not in stasis?" "Because I patched it," Dean said. He reached over with his right hand and found the end of the industrial tape. "I need you to clean it out. Get the machine grease out of the wound and then seal it properly." "You patched it." Gibbs repeated the words as if they were a mathematical impossibility. "With what?" "That appears to be 0G vacuum sealant tape, a highly toxic industrial adhesive." "It was all I had," Dean grunted. He gripped the edge of the tape. The adhesive had bonded strongly to his skin and the dried blood underneath. He knew this was going to be miserable. He braced himself, taking a short breath, and ripped the tape backward in one sharp, violent motion. The sound of the adhesive tearing away from flesh and hair was loud. Dean couldn't stop the sharp, involuntary hiss that escaped his teeth. He clenched his jaw, his eyes watering instantly. The tape pulled the makeshift synthetic rag away with it, ripping open the partially coagulated scab that had begun to form. Fresh, bright red blood instantly welled up from the ragged, inch-deep trench in his bicep, spilling over his pale skin and dripping onto the sterile white examination table. Behind him, Arthur groaned and collapsed into a seated position on the floor, unable to watch. Chloe turned her back, her mandibles clicking in frantic distress. Dr. Gibbs did not panic, but all 6 of his eye stalks recoiled violently, pressing flat against his thick neck. "By the void," Gibbs breathed, staring at the bubbling red laceration. "The inner mechanisms, they are completely exposed. I can see the contractile tissues. Why is it pulsating?" "That's just my muscle spasming," Dean grunted, grabbing a sterile, white gauze pad from a nearby tray and pressing it firmly against the cut to stop the fresh bleeding. "Look, Doc, I know human biology isn't your specialty. Just give me some iodine or whatever broad-spectrum antiseptic you have that won't melt carbon-based flesh, and I'll clean it." "Clean it?" Gibbs stammered, his confident, authoritative bedside manner entirely gone. "Dean, this casing is ruptured beyond simple surface sterilization. The localized pressure is failing. The gap is too wide for chemical coagulants. We must amputate the limb and cap the joint to prevent total exsanguination." Dean stared at the alien, his tired brain trying to process the words. "Amputate," Dean said, his voice dangerously low. "You want to cut off my arm because of a 1-inch deep cut? It is the only logical protocol for a breach of this magnitude that cannot be chemically fused," Gibbs insisted, gesturing wildly with his thin, leathery arms. "If the fluid continues to leak, your central pump will fail." Dean closed his eyes, fighting a sudden, intense wave of sheer exhaustion. He was thousands of light years from Earth, sitting in a sterile room smelling of ammonia, arguing with a faceless alien who wanted to chop off his arm over a wound that a high school nurse could have fixed. "Nobody," Dean said, opening his eyes and glaring directly at Gibbs's central eye stalk, "is cutting off my arm." The standoff in the medical bay lasted for 3 tense minutes. Dean refused to move, his hand clamped over the bloody gauze on his arm. Gibbs paced back and forth, his multi-jointed legs clicking frantically, consulting a glowing datapad filled with human anatomical schematics he clearly didn't fully comprehend. "Your medical archives," Gibbs finally said, stopping and pointing a trembling digit at the screen. "They detail a primitive, barbaric method for repairing major casing breaches. It is called suturing." "Yes," Dean sighed, relief washing over him. "Stitches. Do you have the equipment for it? Suture thread? Or a dermal stapler?" "I have a surgical stapler," Gibbs admitted, his voice tight. "It is utilized for binding temporary synthetic grafts on heavy-hide species like the Krogans. But to use it on your primary, unarmored dermis..." The alien shuddered. "It involves driving metal tines directly into your living sensory tissue. The localized trauma would be immense." "I don't care. Bring it here," Dean ordered. "And bring a topical numbing agent. Whatever you have that works on humans." Gibbs moved to a locked cabinet. He returned a moment later with a heavy, stainless steel device that looked entirely too much like a standard office stapler, only with a viciously curved nose. He also carried a small spray bottle. "This is a localized nerve dampener," Gibbs said, holding up the bottle. "It is designed to temporarily sever the synaptic pathways in the epidermis. However, human neurology is remarkably dense. I cannot guarantee it will penetrate deep enough to numb the underlying contractile tissue." "Just spray it," Dean grunted, moving the bloody gauze away. The wound was still seeping, angry and raw. Gibbs leaned in, his eye stalks twitching, and sprayed a fine, cold mist over the laceration. It smelled like peppermint and burning rubber. Dean waited for 10 seconds. He tapped the skin near the edge of the cut. It felt thick and distant, like touching a heavy leather glove. But the deep, burning ache in the muscle below remained untouched. "It's numb enough on top," Dean said. He held his arm out, rotating his wrist so the laceration faced the ceiling. "Do it. Pull the edges together and staple them." Gibbs hesitated. The alien's hands hovered over Dean's arm, the heavy stapler shaking slightly. "You are asking me to intentionally puncture your remaining intact casing to bind the broken edges. This contradicts every principle of biopreservation." "Doc, if you don't do it, I'm going to take that thing and do it myself," Dean warned, his patience entirely exhausted. "Just squeeze the trigger." Gibbs took a hesitant breath. He reached out with his left hand, his leathery fingers surprisingly cold, and pinched the ragged, bloody edges of Dean's skin together. Dean flinched. The nerve dampener hadn't reached the torn muscle. The pressure of Gibbs's fingers forcing the raw meat together sent a sharp, agonizing spike of pain straight up his arm into his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw muscles clenching until they ached. "Hold still," Gibbs whispered, sounding sick. The alien positioned the nose of the stapler over the closed wound. Clack hiss. Dean's entire body jerked. It felt exactly like what it was. A thick piece of metal being driven through his skin and violently bent closed to hold his flesh hostage. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He gripped the edge of the metal examination table with his right hand so hard his knuckles turned white. 1, Gibbs counted, his voice trembling. He moved the stapler half an inch down. Clack, hiss. Dean let out a low, guttural groan, grinding his teeth. The metallic taste of blood flooded his mouth. He had bitten the inside of his cheek. The pain was sharp, electric, and utterly violating. Clack, hiss. The fluid is stopping, Bennett noted from the doorway, his translation software picking up the clinical observation, though his voice lacked its usual monotone. The metal bindings are applying counterpressure to the localized circulatory vessels. Clack, hiss. 4, Gibbs murmured. 2 more. Dean didn't answer. He was focused entirely on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He focused on the cold metal of the table beneath his right hand. He focused on the hum of the air vents, anything to distance himself from the brutal, mechanical pinching in his arm. Clack, hiss. Clack, hiss. Done. Gibbs stepped back quickly, dropping the heavy stapler onto a metal tray with a loud clatter. The alien looked exhausted, his eye stalks drooping limply against his neck. Dean opened his eyes. He looked down at his arm. It was ugly. The ragged tear was now violently pinched together by 6 heavy, silver surgical staples. The skin around the metal was puckered and white from the numbing spray, rimmed by a bruising, angry purple that was already beginning to form. A thin line of fresh blood seeped from the seam, but it wasn't flowing. The breach was sealed. "I have sterilized the area with an iodine equivalent," Gibbs said, his voice faint. "I will wrap it in a sterile pressure bandage. You must return in 10 planetary cycles to have the metal tines extracted." "Yeah, thanks, Doc," Dean mumbled. He felt incredibly drained. The adrenaline was entirely gone, leaving him hollowed out and shivering slightly in the cool air of the infirmary. Gibbs quickly and wordlessly wrapped Dean's arm in a thick layer of white synthetic gauze, securing it tightly. When Dean finally slid off the examination table, his boots hitting the floor felt heavier than before. He rolled his left shoulder. The arm was stiff, the skin pulling uncomfortably against the staples with every movement. But the terrifying hot throb of the open wound had settled into a manageable, dull ache. He looked toward the door. Arthur, Chloe, and Bennett were standing exactly where they had been. They hadn't spoken since the stapling began. As Dean walked toward them, they didn't just part to make way. They physically backed away, pressing themselves against the corridor walls. "Dean," Chloe whispered, her mandibles entirely still. The acrid smell of her fear pheromones was gone, replaced by something entirely different, a silent, overwhelming awe. "You commanded the medic to pierce your flesh with iron." "It's steel, actually," Dean corrected tiredly, running his good hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Surgical steel. You utilized metal to permanently fuse a catastrophic casing failure," Arthur added, his deep voice hushed, reverent. "Will the metal become part of your structure? Will it merge with your chassis?" "No, Arthur. Like the doc said, they take the staples out in a couple of weeks. The body heals the gap underneath. It'll leave a scar, a line of dead, hard tissue where the skin grew back together." "It grows back together," Bennett repeated. The silicon alien's hydrostatic tubes pulsed a slow, deep blue. "Your species does not merely plug a leak. You rebuild the broken hull from within, using your own internal matter, leaving the repaired section thicker and harder than before." Dean paused, looking at the three of them. He was just a tired engineering student who wanted to go back to his dorm, take some ibuprofen, and sleep for 12 hours. But looking at their wide, unblinking eyes, he realized what they had just seen. They hadn't just seen a student fix a cut. They had watched a fragile, unarmored creature bleed out on a floor, stop the bleeding with industrial waste, walk to a medic, and willingly allow metal spikes to be driven into its flesh to hold itself together, all while remaining fully conscious and complaining about the inconvenience of it all. He wasn't just a classmate anymore. To them, he was a terrifying, indestructible anomaly, a creature that couldn't be broken, only temporarily inconvenienced. Dean sighed, a small, cynical smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, Bennett," Dean said, walking past them into the cool, blue corridor. "We grow back together. Now, someone text Professor Higgins. Tell him I'm taking tomorrow off." Waking up the next morning was a masterclass in regret. Dean's eyes snapped open in the cramped dark of his dorm room. He had tried to roll over in his sleep, a subconscious habit, and the sudden, violent pulling sensation in his left bicep acted like a cattle prod to his nervous system. He gasped, his back arching off the thin foam mattress. He lay frozen for a long moment, staring up at the low, gray ceiling of his quarters. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the smell of his own dried sweat. The nerve dampener Dr. Gibbs had sprayed on him yesterday was completely gone. In its place was a vicious, unrelenting tightness. His left arm felt heavy, swollen to twice its normal size beneath the thick layers of synthetic white gauze. Every microscopic beat of his heart sent a rhythmic, localized thud of pressure against the surgical staples. It didn't burn anymore. It just felt as though someone had clamped a vice grip onto his muscle tissue and left it there. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, moving with the careful, deliberate slowness of an old man. The artificial gravity in the dorm block was set to standard Earth norm, but his body felt incredibly heavy. The adrenaline hangover had settled deep in his marrow, leaving him lethargic and hollow. He stumbled to the small sonic shower unit. Peeling off his sleep shirt was a one-handed logistical nightmare. He managed to catch a glimpse of his shoulder in the cracked, polished steel mirror above the sink. The skin creeping out from beneath the top edge of the bandage was a spectacular, mottled canvas of deep violet, sickly yellow, and angry red. The bruising was extensive. The trauma of the blunt force impact from the heavy metal casing had finally bloomed. "Fantastic," Dean croaked, his voice thick with sleep and dehydration. He turned the tap on with his right hand, cupping the cold, heavily recycled water and splashing it over his face. It tasted faintly of iodine and dust. An hour later, heavily caffeinated on a cup of synthetic sludge that tasted like burnt dirt, Dean pushed through the pneumatic doors of the Sector 2 cafeteria. The cafeteria was a massive, vaulted space designed to accommodate 100 different dietary needs. It sounded like a rainforest canopy, a chaotic blend of chirps, clicks, low-frequency hums, and the clatter of feeding implements. The air was a thick, humid cocktail of smells: raw methane, roasting algae, and the sterile tang of nutrient paste. Dean grabbed a plastic tray with his good hand. He moved down the human-compatible line, scooping a pile of reconstituted eggs and a protein square onto his plate. He kept his left arm tucked close to his chest, the bright white bandage a stark contrast against his dark gray hoodie. As he turned from the serving station, he realized the ambient noise in his immediate vicinity had dropped. It wasn't a complete silence, but a distinct, localized hush that rippled outward as he walked. He kept his eyes fixed forward, navigating toward a corner table, but he could feel the weight of a dozen different alien gazes boring into him. A towering, heavily muscled reptilian student, a species known for aggressive, territorial behavior in the lower transit decks, was walking down the aisle in the opposite direction. Usually they didn't yield space for humans. Today, the reptilian spotted Dean, its slit pupils widening slightly. It immediately stepped to the side, pressing its massive, scaled bulk against a hydroponic pillar, giving Dean a full 3 feet of clearance. Dean frowned, nodding awkwardly as he passed. The reptilian didn't break eye contact, its throat pouch vibrating in a low, subvocal rumble of wary respect. He reached his table and sat down heavily. The plastic chair groaned under his weight. "You are radiating anxiety, Dean." Dean didn't even flinch. He looked up from his tray. Chloe was standing across the table, her 4 lower limbs perfectly still, her upper claws clasped neatly in front of her obsidian glass thorax. "I'm not radiating anxiety, Chloe. I'm trying to eat my breakfast in peace, but half the cafeteria is staring at me like I'm about to detonate," Dean grunted, stabbing the protein square with his fork. Bennett slid into the space next to Chloe, his heavy, boulder-like chassis scraping against the floor plating. His hydrostatic tubes were pulsing a calm, deep green. "They are not expecting you to detonate. They are attempting to calculate your durability threshold. The network is saturated with data packets regarding your incident." "What incident?" Dean asked, chewing the dry, tasteless protein. "I got a cut. I went to the nurse. End of story." "That is not the narrative circulating on the internal mesh," Bennett said, his translation collar remaining perfectly flat, entirely devoid of the drama the words carried. The current dominant theory is that your casing is not a biological shell, but a pressurized containment vessel for an aggressive, regenerative parasite that rebuilt your breached hull using metal spikes it grew from its own matter. Dean stopped chewing. He stared at the silicon alien. They think I grew the staples? The Krogans on Deck 4 believe you absorbed the hyperlathe's casing and are currently incorporating its tungsten alloy into your skeletal structure, Arthur added, walking up to the table with a tray full of what looked like wet gravel. The leathery alien sat down carefully. I attempted to correct them. I explained that Dr. Gibbs forcibly drove the metal into your organic tissue while you were fully conscious. Oh, great. Thanks, Arthur. That's much better, Dean sighed, rubbing his right temple. A headache was building behind his eyes. It was the truth, Arthur said softly, his deep, dark eyes fixing on Dean's bandaged arm. They did not believe me. They stated that no sentient organism would willingly subject itself to structural impalement to fix a fluid leak. They assume you must lack a centralized pain reception network. Dean looked down at his eggs. His arm throbbed, a hot, tight pinch pulling at the staples beneath the gauze. His skin was itching, a maddening, deep tissue itch that meant the torn edges of his muscle and skin were desperately trying to knit themselves back together. He felt exhausted, sore, and profoundly mortal. I have plenty of pain reception, Arthur, Dean said quietly, dropping his fork. I'm just really tired. We will escort you to the laboratory, Chloe announced, her mandibles clicking with renewed protective authority. If any organism attempts to challenge your territorial dominance today, I will release defensive pheromones. Please don't do that, Dean muttered. But he didn't argue as they formed their protective ring around him once more, walking him through the parted sea of the cafeteria. Advanced xenomechanics was being held in Bay 4 again. When Dean stepped through the pneumatic doors, the heavy scent of burnt sugar and ozone hit him instantly, turning his stomach. His body instinctively tensed, his left arm pulling tighter to his ribs in an automatic biological flinch against the space where he had been hurt. The hyperlathe in the center of the room was surrounded by a glowing, hard-light perimeter fence. A bright yellow holographic warning sign rotated above it, flashing alien script that roughly translated to catastrophic biohazard, unstable apparatus. Professor Higgins was hovering near the whiteboard. Higgins was a sentient, gelatinous orb, roughly the size of a beach ball, suspended in an anti-gravity harness. The professor communicated through complex, rapid shifts in chromatophores across its translucent surface. The translation collar around Dean's neck picked up the specific light frequencies and converted them to audio. As Dean walked into the room, Higgins immediately flashed from a calm, instructional blue to a violent, strobing combination of hazard yellow and deep, bruised purple. "Student Dean!" the professor's synthesized voice boomed across the lab, the translation collar giving it a crisp, Oxford English accent. "You have returned to the instructional space. This is highly irregular. Your biological casing sustained a Class 4 rupture yesterday. Standard recovery protocols dictate a minimum of 30 planetary cycles in a localized stasis field." "I don't have a stasis field, Professor," Dean said, stopping at the edge of his workstation. The heavy metal grating of the floor beneath his boots was spotless, but he could vividly remember the sound of his blood hitting it. Splat, splat. He pushed the memory away, forcing his posture to remain relaxed. "I have stitches, and a note from Dr. Gibbs clearing me for light duty." Higgins floated closer, bobbing slightly in the air. The orb shifted to a swirling pattern of inquisitive gray. "Explain stitches." The medical report indicated metal binding struts were embedded directly into your sensory tissue to halt fluid depressurization. "It's a temporary mechanical hold," Dean explained, wishing for the 100th time that humanity wasn't the only squishy, carbon-based, high-pressure, circulatory species on the station. "The staples hold the edges of the breach together. Underneath, my body creates a biological glue. Fibrous tissue called collagen spans the gap, pulling the torn edges back into a single sheet. Once the weld holds, the metal comes out." The lab was dead silent. Every alien student in the room was listening. "Your biology welds itself," Higgins translated, pulsing a slow, rhythmic purple. "It uses internal matter to forge a new structural bond across a catastrophic fault line." "Yeah, it leaves a scar. The new tissue is a little disorganized, tougher than the original skin, but it holds." Dean grabbed a small diagnostic scanner from his workbench with his right hand. "Can I just finish mapping the thermal outputs today? I won't lift anything heavy." Higgins flashed a bright, affirmative green. "You may proceed, Student Dean. However, you are forbidden from interfacing with any pressurized systems. If your biological weld fails, I will not have my laboratory contaminated by another fluid expulsion." Dean exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Understood." He moved to the manifold they had been working on yesterday. Chloe, Bennett, and Arthur were already there. They watched him with an intense, suffocating focus. Dean needed to recalibrate the optical sensor on the side of the casing. It was a two-handed job. He needed to hold the sensor flush against the metal while twisting the locking collar tight. He didn't think about it. Muscle memory took over. He lifted his left arm, reaching out to brace the sensor. The moment he raised his elbow away from his ribs, the bruised, swollen skin around the laceration pulled taut. The metal staples dug brutally into the raw, inflamed tissue. A sharp, breathless spike of agony shot from his bicep straight into his jaw. It felt like the wound was being ripped open all over again. Dean froze. His left hand was inches from the sensor. He couldn't push forward. The pain was a physical wall, warning him that one more inch of extension would tear the fragile, coagulated scab beneath the gauze wide open. A cold prickle of sweat broke out on the back of his neck. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, tiny sound. He held his arm suspended in the air. He didn't drop it. He couldn't. If he dropped it and clutched his arm, he'd validate every terrifying rumor circulating the station. He'd be the fragile thing that leaked. He locked his jaw, his teeth grinding together silently. He let the pain wash over him, a hot, vicious wave, and he refused to move. He slowly, agonizingly lowered his arm back to his side, hiding the tremor in his fingers by tucking his thumb into his fist. "Arthur," Dean said, his voice coming out an octave lower, strained tight as wire. "Hold the sensor flush. I'll lock the collar." Arthur moved immediately, his leathery hands placing the sensor against the casing. "Your casing. It resisted the extension. Did the metal struts cause internal damage?" "No," Dean lied, using his right hand to aggressively twist the locking collar until it clicked into place. He leaned heavily against the workbench, letting the cool metal seep through his hoodie. "It's just stiff, still booting up." He caught Chloe staring at him. Her compound eyes were dark, unreadable, but her mandibles gave a slow, deliberate click. She had seen the micro flinch. She had seen the sweat break out on his skin. She knew exactly how much pain he was in, and she was watching him actively choose to ignore it. She didn't emit fear pheromones. She didn't shriek. She just turned back to her console and quietly adjusted the thermal parameters to make his job slightly easier. It was the closest thing to respect he had ever gotten from a mantis the size of a tractor. 14 days. That was how long it took for the human body to weave enough collagen across an inch-deep canyon of torn muscle to hold it together without metal scaffolding. 14 days of itching, dull aching, and washing himself with one hand wrapped in a plastic bag. When Dean returned to the medical bay, the air still smelled aggressively of ammonia. Dr. Gibbs was waiting for him, clutching a small, sterile, stainless steel tool that looked disturbingly like needle-nose pliers. Arthur, Chloe, and Bennett were standing against the far wall. They hadn't been invited, but when Dean left the dorm, they had silently fallen into step around him. Gibbs didn't ask them to leave. The alien medic seemed just as nervous as they were. Dean sat on the edge of the examination table, pulling his hoodie off his left shoulder. He unwound the final layer of gauze himself. The skin beneath was no longer purple and yellow. It had faded to a sickly, mottled green and pale brown. The swelling had gone down, but the laceration itself was a stark, brutal feature. The skin was puckered tightly around the 6 surgical staples. The wound beneath the metal was closed, covered in a dry, dark, crusty scab, edged with bright, raw pink tissue. It didn't look like a seamless repair. It looked like a battlefield trench that had been hastily filled in. Gibbs's eye stalks extended, hovering inches over the arm. The fluid has entirely ceased. The structural gap is sealed with dense biological webbing. "That's the scar tissue forming," Dean said, looking away. He hated this part. "Just pull them out, Doc." Gibbs slid the lower jaw of the staple remover beneath the center of the first metal staple. "This will break the upper layer of the new dermis," Gibbs warned. "Prepare for localized trauma." Gibbs squeezed the handles. The tool crimped the center of the staple, bending the metal upward, which pulled the 2 sharp prongs out of Dean's flesh in a smooth reverse arc. It felt incredibly strange. A sharp pinch, followed by a sliding frictional burn as the metal slid out of the healed tracks, leaving behind 2 tiny bleeding pinpricks. 1, Gibbs counted. Dean breathed out slowly. It was nothing compared to the day he put them in. Pinch slide, pinch slide. Gibbs worked methodically. With every staple removed, a tiny line of fresh blood beaded up, quickly wiped away by a sterile swab. When the final staple clattered onto the metal tray, Gibbs stepped back, his eye stalks retracting in a gesture of profound relief. Dean looked down at his arm. The metal was gone. Left behind was a jagged, raised line of furious pink skin, roughly 2 inches long, bisected by 6 sets of tiny dark red dots where the staples had been. It was ugly. It was permanent. The hair wouldn't grow back there. The skin would always be slightly thicker, slightly tighter than the rest of his arm. He ran his right thumb gently over the raised ridge of the scar. It was numb on the surface, but a deep, dull ache resonated in the muscle beneath the pressure. It held. The biological weld was complete. "It is imperfect," Bennett noted, his blocky gray frame stepping closer. His optical sensors whirred, focusing on the pink ridge. "The surface is uneven. The structural lines do not align with original factory specifications." "It's a scar, Bennett," Dean said, pulling his hoodie back up over his shoulder. He felt remarkably light. The tight pinching restriction of the metal was gone. His arm belonged entirely to him again. "It's not supposed to be pretty. It's just supposed to keep the insides from becoming the outsides." "It is a record," Arthur rumbled, his leathery face solemn. He reached out one of his lower hands, pausing an inch from Dean's arm, not quite touching it. "Your chassis physically records its failures. It documents the trauma, builds a reinforced barrier over the breach, and wears the history of the event on its exterior." Dean paused, his hand gripping the hem of his hoodie. He had never thought of it that way. To him, it was just a consequence of being clumsy with a hyper lathe. To them, it was a biological ledger. "I suppose it is," Dean said softly. "We were incorrect," Chloe stated, her mandibles clicking in a slow, rhythmic pattern. She stood tall, her compound eyes fixed on Dean, not with fear, but with a cold, analytical reverence. "We believed human biology was fragile because it is soft and unarmored. We failed to account for the hostility of your internal processes. You are not a delicate casing, Dean. You are a fluid-filled forge." Dean hopped down from the examination table. His boots hit the floor, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he didn't wince. The dull ache in his arm was just background noise now, a permanent resident he could easily ignore. He looked at his 3 friends, realizing that the dynamic had permanently shifted. He wasn't the squishy, vulnerable exchange student anymore. He was the organism that survived its own depressurization. He was the creature that forged itself back together with raw iron and its own blood. "Come on," Dean said, a genuine, tired smile finally breaking across his face. He walked past them toward the exit. "Let's go get some of that terrible synthetic coffee. I need to figure out how to explain a medical bill for staple removal to my advisor. Humanity doesn't survive the stars because we have bulletproof exoskeletons, pressurized hulls, or redundant hydrostatic organs. We survive because when the universe breaks us open, our bodies simply refuse to accept the eviction notice. We patch the hole with duct tape, staple the seam shut, and forge a biological weld that leaves us tougher, uglier, and far more terrifying than